The purpose of this particular recording is to go over sections 3 and 4 of the teacher work sample. We're going to begin with section 3, the assessment plan. You'll find this on page 14 of the manual. The purpose of the assessment plan is for you to tell us how you plan on determining if the kids actually met your objectives. Now, as I'm sure you can appreciate, no one wants to go through an entire unit, never really knowing whether or not they get it or not, and then take a big high-stakes test at the end of the unit, bomb it, and really feel like they had an entire unit that was a waste of time. So what we try to do, as you've been taught throughout your program, is to have a series of what we call assessments for learning. And these are formative assessments, both informal and formal. And what we mean by informal would be perhaps maybe that you don't collect data, it's more anecdotal. You're kind of looking around the class, maybe a quick thumbs up, thumbs down, so you're not actually counting folks. That's an example of an informal. But these informal and formal, formative or assessment for learning, tests and assessments, checks for understanding, are planned throughout your entire unit. You start with a pre-assessment because the bottom line is you need to find out what the kids already know. You've already established your objectives in section 2, so this pre-test should be given before you start planning section 4, which is where you review your instructional design. Section 3 is your assessment plan. So you'll tell us about the pre-assessment that you've done. We'll talk about what that will look like in a second. You'll review all of your assessments for learning, and then you'll tell us about that post-test that you're going to give at the end. The bottom line is we have to make sure that you are formally assessing at least 2 learning objectives. If you list a learning objective, then you need to make sure that it's assessed, that you can report on how students did in achieving it. We also need to make sure that if your pre-assessment results come back and show a different level of knowledge than you expected, that you make adjustments within section 2 before you go in and start planning your instruction in 4. Because of this, I would suggest that before you have to write section 4, you're having that pre-assessment done far in advance. Please keep in mind that your pre-assessment and your post-assessment have to have 40% of the same questions in order to be comparable statistically. And again, we'll go over that again in a second. So section 3, you're telling us about your pre-test, all your formative assessments in between, and then your post-test. And you're aligning those assessments to your objectives that were discussed in section 2. So you're actually going to begin this section with this table. Here you list your objectives. You tell us, just give us a description of the assessment used to determine if they've met the objective. And then if you have any kids on IEPs or if you have any other outstanding element that we need to note for which you'll be making modifications and accommodations to your assessments, you would list those here. So as asked in another class, if you list here what your pre-assessment is going to be, what would you write in the objective? You would just put objectives 1 through 5 if you only have 5. If you have 7 objectives, 1 through 7. If you've got 3 objectives, 1 through 3, because the pre-assessment is to assess all objectives. So for instance, I would put here objectives 1 through 5. I would list pre-assessment and give a description. Maybe it's a multiple choice, a true false, some observation that you're doing. If I have some IEP kids or some multiple intelligence, component I should be taking into consideration, I'll describe that here. Then over here, I'll put lesson 1 and I'll actually write out my objective. We want the reader just to know what it is. We don't want them to have to go back and look for the text up in section 2. Then I'm going to say what my assessment is. If it's a worksheet or it's a class presentation, a test, like a short quiz or an exit slip, all of that would be described. And again, you'd list your modifications. And you do this all the way down through lesson 5. And then at the end, you have your post-test, a description of the post-test, and you're going to have your objectives, 1 through 5 again. Post-test, a description of modifications. This table is actually the first thing that the reader sees when they get into section 3. No narrative is prior to this. This is the first thing they see. After you provide this table and the information within, that is when you provide to us a narrative of sorts that describe your rationale for preparing this assessment plan as you have. So for instance, you might talk about the fact that you knew that the students wouldn't have access to support at home, so you didn't send home a worksheet, everything's done in class, and so that in-class worksheet becomes your assessment. You want to make sure that the decisions you're making are based on that information you gathered in section 1 about your learners and their community and their situation. So as you can see, as outlined here, you basically are just giving us a narrative describing your rationale. Why did you make the decisions you made? And you're also kind of demonstrating to us a command of best practices in your content area. So if you're teaching something on social studies, you probably should have historical inquiry there. If you're doing something with science, you should probably have something in there with the scientific method and experimentation. So we want to make sure that if you're doing something with literacy, it's got writing, that whatever assessments are you're choosing, that you're actually demonstrating that you have a command of what really ought to be used in your content area. So again, you start with the table, and then after the table, you describe the best practices. So what are other elements, again, that you need to make sure you remember? As mentioned before, 40% of the test items must be the same between the pre and post test. The pre-test should be given well in advance of the unit so that you have time to make adjustments to your objectives in section 2 and your instructional plan in section 4. You also want to make sure that you keep track of your gains and losses, and you want to make sure that you do it either in points or in percentages. So let me explain. If student A got 5 out of 10 on a pre-test, but your post-test has 12 questions or 12 points, and then you give it to us in a percentage, I can't compare a percentage post-test when it's worth different points to a a percentage in a post-test and points in a pre-test. I don't know how to compare those. I either need to compare point to point value or percentage to percentage. Let me give you a tip. If your pre and post tests are going to be worth the same amount of points, feel free to report them just as points or just as percentages. But if your pre and the post do not have the same point value, I would not try to report by points. I would only report by percentage. And again, if you have questions about that, be sure to let us know. So as you can see here, pages 14 and 15 go over for you some of those tips and pitfalls that we tend to see. In general, with section 3, the only issue that I tend to see is the not reporting them consistently between points or percentages. The other element is not having varied methods of measurement. So everything becomes a pencil paper, everything becomes a worksheet, or everything becomes observation. What we want to do is really mix that up. The assessment plan should demonstrate variety of opportunity for the kids to show you what they know how to do or what they know. If you slide down there, you can see common challenges are always given to you. But what I want to do is just make sure that you are constantly going back and looking at the rubrics, because as you can see here, they're going to look for, okay, if you chose to teach a unit in math and you're going to be dealing with word problems, when you talk about your assessment, if you say you're going to take points off for grammar, but you really just want to know if they can do the math computation, that suddenly invalidates your assessment because you're not really testing. Your grades for that test don't really stand for what you said you were looking for. You were looking for content mastery of math. You didn't also write an objective about, some English literacy standard. So we want to see in your assessment description that what you're testing and the rubrics within align with the objective. So just go through this rubric and look for that. You can see here where it's talking about multiple modes and approaches. Again, we're looking for that variety. So be sure to look at the rubrics in their entirety and read them. You might even grade your own TWS against these rubrics to see how well you would score yourself. As I go on, then I'm going to go into section 4. Section 4 is your design for instruction, and as you can see, this is literally an extension of the table that was put into TWS section 3. My suggestion is that you copy that section 3 table, paste it into section 4, but then add this column in between. What we want to do is basically show the reader These are the objectives. This is how I told you I was planning on knowing if they got it. Well, let me tell you how I'm going to get them there. And here you're going to give us, not in full sentences, but bulleted overviews of the methods you're going to use to get them there. What we want to emphasize is the use of technology. That is the greatest weakness in this section for all students in all areas. With everyone having had 3 technology courses, we really want to see rich representation from that. And so we want it to be purposeful. We want the students to be using it and you to be using it. So we're looking for technology usage. We're looking for the integration of literacy here, writing and reading opportunities in all areas. We're looking for higher level thinking opportunities. And we're looking here, when you get to the adaptations, that you're giving us a glimpse of the kind of differentiation you'll be providing based again on those variables back in TWS Section 1. Following the table, you're going to give us a rationale for each lesson. So literally you'll put lesson number 1 and you'll describe for us why you structured it that way. Then you'll do lesson number 2 and do the same thing, and so on. If you are leaving out something that you know we are going to want, you have to tell us why. So as you can see here is if you don't use technology, you have to give us a really good reason as to why that's not happening in order for points to not be deducted accordingly. I also want to make sure you know that you are still designing the 5 M&U lesson plans, but they aren't inserted within your TWS narrative. TWS Section 4 is exactly structured as I have said here, but your lesson plans are going to be uploaded separately. This table is a summary of what you're putting into that lesson plan. Be sure as you're teaching, because sections 1 through 4 is your plan, and most of you by the time you get done with section 4 are immediately going to start teaching. And section 5 is to come later in a different seminar. Please note, to help you prepare for section 5 as you teach, keep just a little piece of scratch paper where you can write down changes that you made when you taught. And this is going to allow you to more easily go back and write section 5 once you've been given kind of a tutorial on that as well. This here again goes over tips. Because this is a plan, any writing you do is going to be done in either present or future tense. You won't be doing it in past because you plan your unit before you teach it. Again, you're going to have a minimum of 5 lesson plans. You can have more, but we only get to see 5. Now, if you have more than 5 lesson plans, does that mean that I should see more than 5 lesson overviews here? Yes. Even though you're only going to give us 5 lesson plans, and let's say your unit has 7, I still should see 7 days represented in the table. So please keep that in mind. But as far as the separate lesson upload, you only give me 5. Okay? So as you go through here again, you'll see another that reviews common challenges that you will face. And most importantly, that you take a look at this rubric. This is where a bulk of your points will be for the TWS. So go through and really strive to hit this 3 mark and make sure that you're meeting all of the elements that are within. You can see we're going to look for alignment. We're going to look that you really are representing your content well. We're going to make sure that it makes sense, that there's a logical flow, that you're not moving kids all over the place and they might get confused. We are absolutely looking for that variety of instruction, assignments. We want to see diversity. We want to see that the kids are getting the spice that they deserve in their instruction. We're also wanting to see that you are linking everything back to that TWS Section 1. So if you've got kids who are kinesthetic and you wrote about that being a major component for you because you've got a class of 20 and 15 of them are boys, well then we would expect to see you talk about that in your rationale within Section 4. And then finally the use of technology. We will go through sections 5 and 6 in a separate recording.